Hi, I'm Sheridan. Thanks for joining me in the studio. I have a customer quilt on the frame, and it is the perfect example of how we can discuss scale. So the quilt, you can see the back of it in the photo. The back is yummy, isn't it? But there are batiks on the other side, and they are half square triangles, and they're quite large. I believe I will measure them, but they are at least 14 inches square. So that means that the quilting does not need to be densed based on the piecing. It means anything can be done large if that's what my client wants me to do. So basically I'm saying the quilt itself doesn't need to be quilted densely. She gave enough backing and batting so that once I completed her quilt, I had an area still left on the frame where I could place 4 pillow tops that she wants quilted. Now she wants to have the quilting play well with the quilt, right? So I'm going to use the very same design. It's called Ribbons and Leaves. It's a beautiful design. So on the quilt, I made the design quite large, 13 inches, which is really the largest I've ever quilted this design. But it's because it was okay for the quilt. So now the pillow tops, they have piecing in them, and they are approximately 14 inches square. So they are pieced, so I have basted them to my batting and my backing, and they are fitting within the throat of my machine. So I'm going to back up the quilt top so that you can see the scale of the quilting, and then we will discuss the scale for the pillow tops. This is a great way to discuss scale. Scale is very important. I had to turn off the overhead lights. The thread color is Lemon Ice. That is a Glide product. You just couldn't see the quilting, and that was the plan. So the quilting is large. You can see how large the blocks are now. So now let's start talking about those pillow toppers. All 4 of the pillow tops have been basted. The first thing I'm going to do is go find Anne's quilt so that we can add another portion to it. I'm going to say finished because the basting is completed. I'm going to go to Design Sew Quilt, Edit Sew Existing. I'm going to go to Customer. I'm going to search. I'm going to put in Anne. Enter. All right. Here is Anne's quilt. I'm going to touch that, and I'm going to say continue. You have another work in progress. Do you want to replace it? So what was I working on? Beth was doing a Quilts of Valor. So we know that that is finished. I'm going to say yes, erase, reset. So I'm not going to quilt this again. My purpose of bringing it up is so that we could look at the scale of the quilting. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to go true size, and I'm going to touch pan. We're going to move this around. You can see that is a very large design, but very, very appropriate for the size of the blocks. And I'm going to zoom in, zoom full, and then I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to choose the very bottom of this quilt so that we can add our pillow toppers underneath it. I want this scale to be on the screen so that we'll be able to see it. So it says touch a reference point on the screen. I'm going to say continue. It says move the needle to the reference point and touch OK. So I'm going to move it over here, probably out of view for a moment, and tell IQ where we are. Now I said OK, and Intelliquilter now knows where we are. We need to tell Intelliquilter about the pillow toppers that we need to quilt next. There's 4 of them. They are 14-inch blocks with piecing, so there's quite a bit going on in each one of those. Therefore, the scale needs to be smaller than the large blocks that were in the quilt itself. So there's more than one way to do this, and really and truly, as you go through your journey with long arm quilting and with using Intelliquilter for your projects, there's so many ways to do things. So you will find a way that's comfortable. And I'm going to choose to create a pantograph that will stitch over all 4 blocks without even having to advance, because these blocks are fitting within the throat space of my machine. So I'm going to set this up. I'm going to do mark on quilt. I'm going to make sure that I include all 4 blocks. And then once I have that set up, I'll bring in the pantograph, and that's when we're going to talk about scale. Okay, here we are. We have the quilt. Let me zoom full so you can see that. So this is the quilt that is on my take-up roller. So this is where I'm going to be placing another pantograph. I am going to go to Add Edit Pattern. I'm going to add a pattern, and I am choosing to do a pantograph. Use an existing block or define a new one. I need to define a new one. So I'm going to go to New Block. How do I want to define the block? I'm going to mark on quilt so that I have all 4 blocks included in my pantograph space. I'm going to go mark on quilt. Move the needle to its first point. So I'm going to back up our view here so you can see a little bit more. I'm going to move the needle to the first point. I'm just going to come over here all the way, make sure that I'm including the blocks. I'm going to say, okay. Now as I move my needle, I'm clicking OK. If I had my presentation clicker here, I would be doing that. I'm just drawing a block large enough to include all of the smaller blocks. These are blocks that will be pillow covers. It's made of the same fabric as the big quilt. And I'm going to close block. Finished. I'm going to go back arrow once. Now I need to add edit pattern. I'm going to add a pattern, and it's going to be a pantograph. I just marked this block, so I'm going to use the current block. It takes me into the catalogs, and I'm going to search LVS, enter. That brings up my leaves and ribbon panto, which is what I used on the quilt top. So I'm going to choose that for my odd rows, continue, choose that for my even rows, continue, and it brings it in at the default of 12 inches. So I'm going to go to the gap and close the gap first. I like to do that. It just is the way my mind works. You have choices. You could do the row height, row height and pattern height first if you wish. Lots of ways to do things. So now I'm going to go to row height, pattern height, and I know that I had this design at 14 inches. So I'm going to not give this a lot of thought. I'm going to go to the keypad, and I'm going to put in 8. Enter. That looks wonderful, and I almost have 2 complete rows. I'm going to play with the row height and the pattern height to get 2 complete rows out of this. So I'm going to go decreasing with the minus. Oh, I'm liking that. I think that's going to be perfect. How do we really know if that's going to be perfect? We are going to go to zoom off and touch true size and touch the pantograph. Pan around by the second button from the top, move this around and look at it. Now, true size is this. Now, when you look at the quilt, the pillow tops, they are quilts. There's just 4 small quilts. This gives you an idea of what I can see. It's really going to be pretty, isn't it? Once I have an understanding about the size of the piecing, and I have an understanding by looking at true size, how this is going to stitch out, That works. That works very well. So I'm going to say finished. I'm going to choose to stitch continuous on the outside, and I'm going to commit. Now it is time to sew the quilt. I'm going to choose this row first, continue, and because there's only 2 rows, I'm going to go ahead and choose the second row, this one, continue, and I am going to stop to cut threads. When I touch sew quilt, the machine is going to move to the beginning of row 1, and we're going to stitch out this pantograph. Okay, we have completed the large quilt with the large scale quilting, and this below that you can see on the screen is where I used marked on quilt, and I actually included all 4 blocks, which are pillow tops. I created 1 block and I quilted an edge to edge. I used the same design as I used on the large quilt. I reduced the scale so it was more appropriate for the piecing. So let's look at that. It's really hard to see the quilting. The thread choice was to blend, but the scale is much nicer for the piecing in the blocks. Love the way this is turning out. Thanks for joining me.